Hello, I'm Nate, aka B2 Mutineer, this time bringing you a video requested by one of my subscribers, my personal ranking of the companions in Dragon Age Origins. I will eventually also rank the companions in DH2 and Inquisition, but this would have gotten multiple hours long if I crammed them all in one video. It's important to understand that I have my own biases and preferences which cause me to like or dislike certain companions. You can absolutely love, hate, or be ambivalent towards whichever companion you want, as everyone is free to have their own opinion. If you want to share your opinion in the comments, please be respectful and don't assume that your opinion is the only valid one. Thank you. Without further ado, let's get into the ranking. I'm going to score the DAO companions based on a few different criteria: their personality, their character development, and their story and gameplay relevance throughout the game. Based on the scores I give them in each of these areas from 1 to 10, 1 being lowest, 5 being average, and 10 highest, they'll get an overall score that's the average of the three. I will of course explain why I give a specific score, and after I individually score all of the companions, I will present the final rankings. I'll score them in alphabetical order, starting with Alistair. I don't enjoy Alistair's personality because he's immature and whiny and refuses to take responsibility while still expecting things to go his way. He'll stomp his feet and grumble and whine, but in the end, he's the more senior warden that ceded authority to our protagonist. Alistair is of course in his early 20s, which can excuse some of his behavior, but I think the real problem is that he can't have too strong of an opinion, both because you're the protagonist and because he's designed to play an important role later during the Landsmeet, so he can't leave the party or try to attack you. Still, I think Alistair has some nice moments, such as his banter with other characters. He has a few too many witty remarks during the main quests for my liking, especially the ones that get too close to breaking the fourth wall, such as at the start of the Nature of the Beast quest when he tells Zevran, "Yes, it seems like you've had your own troubles, what are the odds?" And he will say this line even if you visit the elves first and haven't yet interacted with the problems of the other factions. But he's fairly charming, well-intentioned, and can be persuaded to understand some of the warden's decisions, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with them. A good team player. Personality score, 6 out of 10. In terms of character development, I think Alistair has a pretty decent arc, depending on the player's choices during the Landsmeet. You can harden him, aka make him understand not everyone is well-intentioned and that he should look out for his own interest and well-being first. Hardened Alistair becomes slightly more assertive, however he continues to be immature, so to me hardening Alistair is a mistake because assertiveness really doesn't mix well with the rest of his character. You can also keep him unhardened during his personal quest, which means he'll keep his far too naive understanding of the world, but at least his character feels more consistent that way and you're not giving him what I think is unearned confidence in himself. I think Alistair can grow up and mature by himself, even if at a slower pace, and I don't find it necessary to push him too fast, especially since he let your warden take the reins to begin with, so he's fine to continue as he is. One thing I really disagree with is him throwing an absolutely nuclear tantrum and leaving the wardens if you decide to put Loghain through the joining. I am not aware of any wardens being free to leave the faction, considering all the secrets they could spill. Fiona was an exception because her taint went away. I don't think Alistair should be given such a privilege just because of his noble blood or otherwise because he is too focused on his own idea of revenge that he can't see the value of having an additional powerful warrior as a Grey Warden during the battle against the Archdemon. Even before Warden explains the role of Warden in killing the Archdemon, both Alistair and your character know that Wardens are better at fighting Darkspawn because they're able to sense them. I would understand asking to not be put directly in a party with Loghain, so in the final battle you'd have to choose between Alistair and Loghain to be in the same party and leave the other behind at the gates. I would also understand a huge approval loss. Choosing to leave a faction that doesn't allow such a thing, not so much. You may think that it's nitpicking, and maybe it is, but it does bother me from a story and lore perspective that Alistair can just do that without consequences. I do think his backstory as a bastard son of Marek raised by Eamon and then sent to the Chantry, as well as the possibility of him becoming a king, whether alone or with Honora, are interesting, but regardless of his potential, the execution feels lacking. Character development score 4 out of 10. In terms of his relevance throughout the game, it's really high. He is the first full humanoid companion you get, and he's very much personally involved in the story due to his background as a warden, his love for Duncan, his noble lineage, Chantry and Templar upbringing, and history with Eamon and Redcliffe. He doesn't have much to say in relation to the Dalish elves and the dwarves, but even there he has reasons to help you get the treaties as a fellow Grey Warden. The game builds him as a weapon and shield tank, which is very useful in combat. Even if you don't have a respecialization mod, you get Alistair early enough that his stats aren't ruined by the auto-leveling system, and you can either keep him as a tank or start putting points into something else, such as dual wielding if you don't want him using a weapon and shield. Relevance score 10 out of 10. Average score 6.6. Next up, the dog. There's not very much I can say about the dog, seeing as it's not a companion you can have real conversations with, or someone with opinions and such about the events of the main story. In terms of personality, he is a kind and intelligent dog who understands you're doing something important and who is loyal to you, following you to the ends of the world to protect you and your companions. Personality score, 7 out of 10. Good boy, but not interesting enough to be rated higher. There's of course not anything very complex going on with Dog's character. No personal quest, no conflict or character development, but I wouldn't expect there to be any character development for an animal companion unless it was magically or technologically enhanced to be able to communicate its thoughts to you. So I'll say that the character development score is not applicable. As to the relevance of Dog throughout the game, it's unfortunately not very high. The dog can be a very good tank early on due to having a bigger health pool, and it can help you out against powerful humanoid enemies once it gets access to the Overwhelm ability. But from the mid-game onwards, I'd almost always pick a proper character since the dog's usefulness falls off, unless I was specifically doing a challenge run of some kind in which it's part of the rules to use him. He also doesn't have any relevance to the story, not having any information or opinions to share, but I'll say the story relevance is not applicable in this case, and I will score this category only based on his gameplay usefulness. Relevance score 4 out of 10. Good early game, but otherwise only useful very situationally, so ends up being below average. Average score 5.5. Moving on to Leliana. In terms of personality, I'm not 100% sold on Leliana, though it kind of makes sense due to her backstory. She's a little bit too cheery and seemingly naive considering her background as a bard involves her knowing about a lot of unsavory sides to people and the world in general. Even if she was more sheltered and blinded to some of the nasty parts by her love for Marjolaine, I still think her personality when you meet her is over the top. What I love is that she's very insightful about people, and you can absolutely see that in her banter with the other companions, as well as some remarks she makes during various quests. She's very empathetic towards people of all races and backgrounds, and is honestly one of the only characters who is outspoken about mages being treated extremely unfairly. I especially love her line when you enter the apprentice quarters in the Circle Tower, where the mages have been locked in with the demons and abominations running rampant, and she says, "This is too cruel. I would not subject even an animal to such a fate." She has interesting stories to tell and provides a different cultural perspective as she grew up in Orlais. We don't really get to know much about Orlais and Orlesians other than the fact that Ferelden's hate them due to having been invaded by them in the past, so it's nice to get at least some details from Leliana. And on top of this, the way you view her can change when you find out about her backstory, especially because you can affect how she deals with her past and how that changes her perspective. Personality score 8.5 out of 10. If she wasn't so over the top in the beginning, I would have given her a 9 or even more. I mentioned you can affect how Leliana deals with her past. Similar to Alistair, she has the possibility to be hardened during her personal quest, in which you deal with Marjolaine, her former bardmaster and lover who betrayed Leliana and made her take the fall for the espionage Marjolaine herself was involved in. If you harden Leliana, she will be more open to morally questionable choices. She will also be less judgmental of Morrigan, and have different epilogues available. I think Leliana's character is really interesting, especially because you encounter her again in Inquisition. And even if you kept her soft during Origins, other events ended up hardening her. And appropriately in Inquisition, you have the option to soften her or keep her hardened. I know we're not talking about her Inquisition character here, but you can absolutely see throughout her journey in Origins that she has the potential to become a more influential and powerful figure with her bard skills as well as her strong convictions. My only issue with her character development in Origins is that it can feel a bit too subtle, especially if you do her personal quest very late after you've done most or all other main quests before the Landsmeet. At that point, most of the changes you'd see in her responses to your warden's choices can't be seen anymore. I wish Leliana was a bit more involved during the Landsmeet quest, perhaps helping you infiltrate the Jarl's estate more easily, or else help you speak to various nobles to gain their support, or even find dirt on them to blackmail them for their support if she's hardened. Things a bard is good at. Character development score 8 out of 10. Would have given her more if her character development caused some relevant changes in one or more main quests, in particular the Landsmeet, as that's where I think she'd easily be able to play a more important role, and a different one at that depending on whether she's hardened or not. Finally, in terms of relevance, I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. Archery in DAO can be really bad unless you know how to build the archer with items that have rapid aim, pump most of their points into dexterity to increase their bow damage, use the aim sustained and the autocrit abilities. Of course, if you do know what you're doing, archery is very powerful. However, until I learned how archery works only a couple of years ago, I either respecialized Leliana into a dual dagger rogue, or else I left her in camp most of the time because having her as an archer in my party felt worse than using another companion. I mostly only used her as the rogue to unlock doors and chests and disarm traps, in playthroughs where my warden wasn't a rogue themselves. In terms of story relevance, Leliana unfortunately doesn't have enough to add other than her empathy. I do consider her empathy a very important point since no other companion shares Leliana's very open-minded perspective. However, as I mentioned in the character development category, her background as a bard is not utilized at all. You can't really have Leliana persuade someone for you or offer you some kind of sneaky diplomatic option during a relevant quest such as the Landsmeet or perhaps in Orzammar when talking to various nobles to convince them to switch their vote to support a particular candidate. Due to this, her relevance score is 7 out of 10. I want to give her a higher score because I like her, but even taking into consideration rogue skills, good archery, or dual wielding if you specialize her, and her empathetic perspective, there's only so much she offers that is unique and feels important enough for you to choose her over another companion for your active party. Overall score, 7.8. If you were to ask for my extremely biased opinion, I'd rate Leliana somewhere around 8.5, but taking into consideration her shortfalls, here we are. Next up, Loghain. Now, Loghain doesn't really count as a full companion, since you can only recruit him after the Landsmeet, meaning that you can only do the side quests and DLC quests with him, other than the Battle of Denrim. Due to this, I'll first talk about all the aspects that go into his character and rate everything at the end, since there's just not that much to go through. Loghain is very limited as a companion. He doesn't have much banter or dialogue, though he has a few more conversations with Wynne compared to everyone else. Not much in terms of character development, since he literally doesn't have time to develop. He doesn't even have a personal quest. You and your character don't really have time to get to know Loghain on a more personal level as a companion, different from his main role during most of the story as a villain, so it can be difficult for him to feel like a proper companion due to this. You don't know what Loghain would have said and felt in regards to the choices you made when you were gathering allies. What would make him approve or disapprove? Would he support annulling the circle or saving the mages trapped inside? These are the kinds of questions that we can only speculate on, and that genuinely makes it hard to compare Loghain to the other companions. His build is already done, and while you can get some level ups after finishing the Landsmeet, it's not enough to be able to shape his build in a different direction. The game's poor auto-leveling system will make Loghain not as good of a weapon and shield warrior as Alistair, since his attributes will be more spread out by the game. If you have the specialization mod, or at least a no auto-scaling past level 7 tweak from Dane's fixes, this isn't a problem anymore, since you can build Loghain to be just as powerful as the others, but that implies using mods, and I know not everyone likes doing so. I think he's a very intriguing character, both as a villain and as a Grey Warden and companion. I don't necessarily agree with some of the a bit too on the nose decisions he makes throughout the game and the way they're presented. He ends up looking like an unstable, intensely paranoid man who has seemingly lost his sense of reality, fighting imaginary enemies of the state. I think if his actions had been written with a bit more nuance and his perspective had been made to be just a little bit easier to empathize with, he'd be a much more powerful villain because you can understand where he's coming from. But unfortunately, there's quite a few inconsistencies in his character. The most glaring one for me is Loghain allowing Tevinter mages to enter Ferelden and take slaves from Denrim's alienage in exchange for coin or other resources. This is after he makes such a huge fuss out of King Cailan wanting to bring in Grey Wardens as well as soldiers and chevaliers from Orlais. For me, it makes no sense he would invite a group of powerful people from a strong foreign country that could just as well take advantage of Ferelden's weakened state. This, plus the choice to use a blood mage to poison Arl Eamon, make him a bit too much of a stereotypical villain who doesn't care or think about the implications of their choices as long as it gets them power. I also would have liked to see a slightly different version of the Battle of Ostergard betrayal, in which due to the Darkspawn taking over the Tower of Vishal, Alistair and our Warden are far too late in signaling Loghain to charge. We see the carnage and Cailan dying, and more importantly, we see Loghain seeing it happen before he makes the decision to retreat, with a regretful expression. It's a small change, but it shows you he was actually considering going forward with the initial plan, but the Darkspawn showed up in far greater numbers than expected and caused absolute devastation on the battlefield. So by the time the beacon was lit, it was far too late, and perhaps a blessing to Loghain's forces that he hadn't charged in earlier, because it would be clear that the army would have lost either way with huge losses. Does it make things much better? No, his act would still be considered a betrayal by most of the soldiers on that battlefield, who until the last moment were hoping to be saved, and by the Warden and Alistair, who did not see what actually happened on the field, and assumed Loghain chose to betray Cailan and the Wardens just because he wanted to. However, it would add a lot of complexity to his character and how he is perceived by the player, which would make it at the very least more compelling to recruit him as a companion at the Landsmeet to get to talk to him and get his side of things. Anyway, this isn't the how I would make Dragon Age Origins better video, so in terms of ranking Loghain as a companion as he currently stands, personality score 7 out of 10. I think there's a lot of potential, but he is a bit undercooked and doesn't have enough interactions as a companion for the player to get to know him on a more personal level. Character development score 6 out of 10. During the course of the game, while he's a villain, he doesn't develop much. He also doesn't change much when he joins the party as a companion. He does change his opinion of the Warden, however, and realizes in retrospect that some of the things he did were wrong. And in the end, he's willing to do what he must as a Warden, either sacrifice himself or do the dark ritual with Morrigan if your Warden can't. I think that considering the super tiny amount of screen time he gets as a companion, he gets to develop at least a little bit, but it's not enough in comparison to some of the full companions. Relevance score 3 out of 10. If I were to score him as a character in the whole game, he'd have a relevance of 10 out of 10, since he's an important character from the very beginning at Ostagar until the end. But as a companion, he's only relevant for the final battle and optional DLCs or side quests. Overall score 5.3 out of 10. I'd give him a higher score if he was written more sympathetically and consistently, and also if the lands meet could occur earlier in the game so that you could recruit him earlier on, get to know him, and actually use him as a companion, not just in the final fight. Ah well, moving on to Morrigan. Morrigan is a very polarizing character. Some people love her, others hate her. I'm in the former camp, since Morrigan is my favorite character in the Dragon Age universe overall. I enjoy her witty and somewhat caustic personality. I like that she often makes fun of and criticizes Alistair, and I love the fact that she doesn't take anyone's shit and will call people out without any reservations. Personality score 10 out of 10. I wouldn't change anything about how her character is written because it all works together perfectly to create a strong, compelling character. Part of why I like Morrigan so much is due to the fact that she has a lot of traits and struggles that are similar to ones of autistic people. Speaking as an autistic person myself, I can relate to Morrigan not understanding many aspects of being proper or polite, and not understanding or enjoying the need for all of the casual touching that is part of social interactions, such as handshakes, hugs, touching someone's shoulder or arm, that kind of thing. Morrigan is incredibly blunt, prefers to keep to herself, and has a specific way of thinking that she has grown to believe is correct, and that everyone else must adhere to the same principles. Morrigan seems to have these traits because she was raised far from society by Flemeth, a powerful entity who has lived for a long time in different bodies and most certainly has a different understanding of people and the world than most. But even if Morrigan's autistic-coded traits come from a different source, she's still relatable to me from an autistic perspective. However, despite Morrigan having quite a harsh and limited view of the world in the beginning of the game, that doesn't mean she can't learn and adjust her perspective when she is finally allowed to leave Flemeth behind and experience the world for herself. If the player takes the time to get close to Morrigan, whether through friendship or romance, she grows to understand the value of emotional bonds with others, and despite only mellowing out slightly in her interactions with your character, you can see that this relationship has altered the direction of her life meaningfully. Indeed, it's lovely to see how her character matures in Inquisition, especially if she has a child and realizes she wants to care for him and nurture him in the way she realizes she herself wasn't cared for, because she understands the need for and positive impact of love. Would I have liked seeing a bit more evidence of her development in her interactions with other companions during Origins? Yes, it would have been great to have a few conditional conversations with other companions, requiring either high approval friendship or romance, which would show her becoming more aware of others' feelings and trying not to be so combative or dismissive. But I recognize that that's outside of the game's scope, requiring extra resources for something that only some players would have gotten to see. Regardless, her character development score is 8 out of 10. Finally, in terms of relevance, she is very useful in combat situations due to being a mage. Her shapeshifting specialization is wasted, since unfortunately shapeshifting isn't good enough, but even with a few points wasted in shapeshifting, she's still an amazing mage. In terms of story, she obviously has her important moment when she offers the Warden the option to do the Dark Ritual. Otherwise, due to the fact that she's an outsider to society, and unfortunately we don't get to interact with a Chased or Avar tribe that she may have more knowledge about and experience with, she doesn't really have much to add in most cases during main quests. Broken Circle is a bit of an exception since as an apostate who grew up very far away from the teachings of the Chantry and the oppression of the Templars, she has an interesting perspective on the Circle. Due to the more limited perspective she brings in terms of story, that brings her score down a bit. Morrigan's relevance score is 8.5 out of 10. You really can't ignore the fact that she's a mage in terms of combat relevance, and the only reason you would choose not to use her is if you want either to use only one mage and prefer Wynne or your own Warden, or for challenge or role-playing reasons such as playing a Warden who fears magic. Overall score 8.8 out of 10. As you can see, not even my absolute favorite character in the entire series gets a 9 or higher, because regardless of loving the game, the story, the world, and the characters, I am still able to see weaknesses and things that could be improved. Next up, Oghren. I don't have anything nice to say about Oghren other than the fact that he had so much potential with his backstory, and it was wasted by making him the disgusting joke character. He is an alcoholic dwarf who makes inappropriate comments to and about women, he farts and belches, and the only redeeming quality he has is that he's a competent fighter who wants to fight the Darkspawn. His personality is a 1 out of 10 for me. Just disgusting and extremely disappointing, considering the fact that he used to be a proud warrior of Orzammar, was the only person in the entire house that was left behind by his paragon wife as she went on an expedition in the Deep Roads to find an important artifact, turned to alcohol to cope with being abandoned like this, and disgraced himself in the provings when he was too violent, almost losing the right to bear arms. There was so much that the writers could have done with that to make it interesting. Oghren also doesn't really change in any meaningful way. Even if you do his personal quest, that just gets Felsi, his surfacer ex-girlfriend, to give him another chance, which ends up in Oghren and her having children together. But then in Awakening, he shows up to join the Wardens, essentially chasing a death sentence to get away from the family he apparently had wanted oh so badly. So his character development score is also a 1 out of 10. In terms of relevance, he does have some things to say in Orzammar, although you only get access to him after you've already gone through most of the political parts of the main quest. He's a forced companion in the Anvil of the Void area where you confront Branka, which I really don't approve of. I think the Warden should absolutely be given the choice to leave Oghren behind just like everyone else, and not be forced to take a two-handed warrior who isn't even built optimally into what can be quite a difficult fight against Branka. He may have interesting things to say during other main quests, though I highly doubt it, seeing as most of his conversations amount to nothing more than jokes about drinking, alcohol, and the aforementioned potty humor. You know what the worst part is? You see a tiny glimpse into the interesting politically savvy dwarf that Oghren could have been at the very end of the Dwarven main quest, where when you return to the Chamber of the Assembly to present the crown of your chosen candidate, Oghren backs you up in an extremely coherent and persuasive way. Who wrote that part of Oghren's dialogue, and why didn't they write more of it? If Oghren was like that, I would probably rate him on the same level as Leliana or Alistair, even if he still had some of the shitty humor or inappropriate comments. I'd be able to overlook those if Oghren was more relevant and had more intelligent things to say, at least sometimes. In terms of combat, he's decent, but unless you go to Orzammar early and manage to get far enough in the main quest to recruit him, by the time people usually go to Orzammar, either last or second to last main quest, he's being auto-leveled by the game way too much. This means his attributes are all over the place, and he doesn't compare to the other warriors you're able to build up from much earlier on. Taking all of this into consideration, Oghren's relevance score is 4 out of 10. I really can't give him more than that. He's a below-average two-handed warrior, and other than at the very end of the Dwarven main quest, he doesn't have anything interesting to say. Doesn't have an interesting perspective upon the world to highlight. This last thing is a particularly important thing, because companions in the game were actually supposed to be designed to show the player some of the opinions that people in Thedas had on various topics. Morrigan and Wynne have very different opinions on magic despite both being mages, and even Alistair and Leliana have their own thoughts on this topic. Some companions feel a certain way about siding with one faction or one individual over another. They're supposed to share their opinions so that the player gets a sense of what the world is like and what opinions people can have. It helps the player feel more grounded in the setting and story, and feel more comfortable making choices of their own and deciding where they stand on an issue. But Oghren just doesn't really add anything to that, and that's a pity. His overall score is 2 out of 10. This may seem a bit harsh to some, but it's how I personally feel towards his character. I honestly could just have Oghren removed entirely and not feel like anything is missing from the game, other than the fact that it would be even more obvious that dwarves are given the short end of the stick, since without Oghren there would be 0 dwarven companions, unless you count Shale as one. Speaking of Shale, she's next. Some people think Shale is a DLC companion, and thus she must automatically be less fleshed out or relevant. But while it's technically true that she was released as a DLC, Shale was actually supposed to be included in the base game. But with EA being EA, it was decided to make Shale a DLC included with the physical copy of the game so that people would be discouraged from purchasing a second-hand copy due to the fact that they'd miss out on the Stone Prisoner DLC. Due to these special circumstances, Shale is mostly like a full companion. It's true that she has slightly less relevance than someone like Alistair or Morrigan, since at least at the time the game was released, some people could simply not have Shale, and it would feel bad to miss out on a really important companion if you, for example, didn't have internet, or not a good enough connection to download a bigger piece of content like this DLC. In terms of personality, I really like Shale's witty, kind of outsider perspective, biased against people and society, based on her previous experiences that she remembers from when she was a golem without free will under the mage Wilhelm's control. It should come as no surprise I enjoy Shale, since she's in many ways similar to Morrigan. And yes, given the chance, with Shale being interested in such a thing, I would have absolutely romanced the golem. However, I think that the dialogue interactions you can have with her are a little bit lacking in depth. You can ask her about her past with Wilhelm, talk to her about being a golem, and later on get her thoughts about dwarves and the fact that she was once a dwarf herself. All of this is fun and interesting and all, but I wish you could have also talked about some more personal things with her if you managed to befriend her. Surely, Shale would have interesting questions or thoughts about the world, opinions on the other companions if you asked her, Even so, with the limited amount of interactions you have with her, and with the fun party banter she has with the others, I absolutely love her. Her voice actress, Geraldine Blecker, was also spectacular. I can't imagine anyone else voicing Shale. Personality score, 8 out of 10. Would have given her a higher score if she had more interactions with the player character. In terms of both character development and relevance, it comes down to the fact that Shale was pushed out of the main game to become a DLC, and so it was fine for her to feel a bit underbaked in comparison to some of the other companions. However, in my opinion, she's certainly much better developed than Oghren or even Sten or Wynne. She has quite a good bit of interesting development if you take her along with you in the Deep Roads and she gets to meet Caradin, who remembers her and tells her that she used to be a dwarf woman who volunteered to become a golem so she could fight the Darkspawn. I love the little conversations between her and the other companions you can hear after this revelation, as well as of course speaking to her yourself and going with her to Kadash Taig so she could see what she could remember of that old life, get some closure in relation to her past. If you have the patience to listen, Shale has some very interesting conversations with the other companions, with Morrigan about shapeshifting magic, with Leliana about faith and the Maker, with Sten about the Qunari philosophy, and the development of their conversations is there. Even if there are just a handful of dialogues we get to hear between Shale and each companion, they feel significant, like they have a clear reason to exist. I also think that interestingly enough, Shale's conversations with the other companions makes them more interesting and complex by allowing them to talk about a particular subject with Shale, who is genuinely interested to learn. Due to this, I give Shale a character development score of 8 out of 10. I feel that she develops enough for it to feel satisfying, but just as with Morrigan, I would have liked to have more interactions which show how traveling with us and remembering her origins has changed Shale's perspective. As for relevance, she manages to be far more important and interesting in the main Dwarven quest than Oghren, who is the base game companion. While Oghren is there because he couldn't get over Branka, Shale chooses to join the Warden on their adventures because she believes fighting Darkspawn is a good cause, and then, if taken to the Deep Roads, she can also discover a part of her past she thought lost forever. She may not have much to say about dwarves, though she does have opinions about mages and birds, but Oghren doesn't have very much to say about the main quests either, so it's comparable. In terms of combat, due to the fact that you can quite easily recruit Shale early, that means the game won't auto-level her too much, so you can put points in the attributes that matter most for her and her gear, and unlock the talents you want her to use as either a tank, a support, or a tanky damager. I find Shale very useful to bring along as a tank, and at the very least she's relevant during the Dwarven main quest. I'll give her a relevance score of 7.5 out of 10. The combat relevance would be a 9, but unfortunately other than in the Deep Roads, she's not very well integrated into the story. Shale's overall score is 7.8. If BioWare had gone ahead with their initial plan and made Shale a full base game companion, she would have been far better integrated into the main story and had more things to say, so her score would have been much higher, probably about the same as Morrigan's. As it stands, she's in good company tying Leliana's score. Moving on to Sten. I personally dislike the way Sten is written and the way the Qunari and their philosophy are presented in Origins. In Inquisition, the Qunari are far better developed. While they are still described as doing horrors to their own people, such as sewing shut the mouths of their mages and re-educating the ones who have apparently lost their purpose, aka torturing and brainwashing them, the Qunari are presented in a much more complex way in Inquisition compared to Origins. In Origins, at least if we consider Sten to be an accurate representative of his people, the Qunari are extremely prejudiced, especially sexist towards women who can only fulfill certain roles in society, and generally very rude about other races and cultures. Even all the way back in 2010 when I first played DAO, the way Sten spoke about women in non-Qunari rubbed me the wrong way, and for some reason, on top of making him say all these unlikable things, the writers also decided to make it part of Sten's backstory that he went in a blind rage and killed a whole family of farmers, children included, because he freaked out about not having his sword. Even if they would ignore all the negative and bigoted comments Sten makes, I can't imagine any realistic scenario in which one of my wardens would agree to take Sten in their party, seeing as he's a ticking time bomb, and seemingly anything could send him into a murderous rage. What if it happens when you're asleep, or when you're already injured or otherwise off guard? Sure, when Sten attacks you in Haven, you can easily beat him because you're ready for it. But if he went berserk at a random moment, suddenly it's not as easy, even if you could potentially have other companions who would try to stop him. I just don't think that a strange hulking man who is clearly mentally unstable is worth the risk, no matter how desperate the Grey Wardens may be. Not only that, but he doesn't really seem to play well with others, in the sense that I can't really see him taking a blow meant for most of your companions. He likely considers some, if not most of them, irrelevant or possibly actively harmful towards the mission. Your mage companions aren't leashed, so to him they probably seem the ticking bomb. Leliana is a woman who fights, so that's a no-no according to Sten. Not to mention, if your warden is a woman, he gets weird about that too. I know I said a bunch of negative stuff about Sten's personality, but I will say he's still not as bad as Oghren. Sten has a few redeeming moments if you can ignore 70% of what he's saying. He does come to respect you if you show assertiveness and are generally more on the practical side. If he respects you, he seems to genuinely follow your lead and considers you a close friend. Can even call you Kadan, which is a Qunari term of endearment that means where the heart lies, a word for a person who one cares about. That said, because his personality doesn't make full sense in terms of reasons for your warden to recruit him, I can't give him anything higher than a 4 out of 10 for his personality score. Sten's character development is almost 0 in terms of his actual thoughts, beliefs, and perspective on the world and life in general. The only thing that can possibly develop is his perception of your warden. Either he dislikes you or is neutral towards you, or he respects you and considers you a close friend. If he doesn't like you, you're just like every other non-Qunari and exactly what he expected. If he does like you, then you clearly must be an exception to the rule. It couldn't be possible that the Qunari are wrong, and people of other cultures and nations can govern themselves and don't need to be conquered to learn to live the right way, could it? Nah. I'll still give him a 3 out of 10 for his character development score, because at least something can change and make him slightly less annoying, though only towards your warden. As for his relevance, unfortunately there isn't really any main quest where Sten is relevant. He has some remarks, most of them about how either humans or elves or dwarves or mages or whatever are bad, and Qunari are superior. Not much actually relevant to help you decide on a course of action, or at least present an interesting perspective. In terms of combat, you do recruit him early in Lothering, although he's built like a two-handed warrior, and I think that's the weakest type of warrior. Without things like haste or swift salves, two-handers are too slow. If you're playing on easy or normal, that won't be as much of a problem, of course, but in general, based on his starting build given by the game, Sten is less useful than Alistair, Shale, and in the early game, even the dog. As far as tanks go, Alistair, Shale, or your own tank warden are better choices, and as far as damage goes, a dual wielder, archer, or mage will generally do better. Due to this, I'll give him the same relevance score I gave Oghren, 4 out of 10. Oghren at least has a few moments during the Dwarven main quest for story relevance, but he's recruited quite late. While Sten doesn't have story relevance at all, the fact you can recruit him early makes up for it, since even if you don't respecialize him and just keep him as a two-hander, he can have a much better build than the auto-scaled garbage Oghren is given by the game. Sten's overall score is 3.6 out of 10. Certainly a score that will no doubt be considered extremely harsh by some, but as I keep saying, this is how I personally feel. Oh boy, it's Wynne's turn next. If you didn't like the score I gave Sten, brace yourself. Due to the writer being in her 20s when she wrote Wynne's character, Wynne acts much older than someone of her age would act. She's canonically 49, 50. They made her look far older than most people in their late 40s look like, and she acts like the worst part of an older individual. Easily influenced by the dominant religious, political, and social institutions, inflexible in her traditionalist thinking, and assuming she knows better just because she's older. She acts like a wise sage even though she has very limited experience with the outside world, seeing as she's a mage who lived most of her life in the Circle Tower among only mages, templars, and priests. She goes once to fight at Ostagar with the king and is pulled away from the big fight when Loghain retreats, and suddenly she has all the right answers to how your Grey Warden should act. The preachy schoolmistress act may work for some, but I personally don't care to be told what to do, and especially not in that condescending, I'm older so you ought to listen way. Other than the wise sage act, she mostly just talks about being old. No offense to the writer, especially as she was tasked with writing a full companion when she was in her 20s, and that was surely a difficult task. But the, "Ahaha, I'm so old, my bones are creaking" jokes are funny maybe once or twice, not so much if that's most of what the character says. Personality score 4.5 out of 10. She's marginally less annoying than Oghren and Sten, because at least she doesn't actively harass or belittle people. But she does share her unwanted advice and implies that if you don't take her advice, you're a bad person in a passive-aggressive way. In terms of character development, she has none. Like, no, really. Her personal quest is about finding an old apprentice who escaped at the tower, and she feels she was a bad teacher, so that's why he left. And then he says it's not her fault, and he would have escaped the circle anyway. She learns nothing out of that, doesn't change at all. Her quest could have been a more complex moral situation that taught her that she doesn't actually understand everyone's situation and things are much less black and white than she thinks. Instead, she gets reassured that she did nothing wrong, her current perspective is correct, her apprentice was just too different, too other, too much of an exception, so it makes sense he escaped the circle, so nothing needs to change. She has lots of opinions on how your warden and the other companions should change and improve themselves, but Wynne herself She's so old, she already knows everything there is to know. Again, as I said, I'm sure some people will be attracted to her mother-like behavior, her constant nagging and criticizing you with good intentions. But yeah, no thanks. Character development score 1 out of 10, simply because just like Oghren, she doesn't change at all. In terms of relevance, here is where Wynne makes up for her whole character. As a mage, she's extremely good in combat, especially since she comes with healing and supporting spells for your party. And as far as story goes, she of course is part of the mage main quest, though I don't agree that she's a forced companion. And because she was at Ostagar and greatly disapproves of Loghain retreating, she has some relevance during your confrontation with him at the Landsmeet, as well as having some things to say during the Return to Ostagar DLC. I guess you can also argue that she presents the Chantry-aligned mage side of things to contrast Morrigan, although she mostly doesn't have that much to say about apostates. She's far too interested in criticizing people for how they talk and act, so other than in some discussions with Morrigan, she doesn't talk enough about magic and mages. Wynne's relevance score is 7.5 out of 10. Her relevance in combat would be a 9 or so. However, she's simply not as relevant in terms of story compared to Alistair, and even slightly less relevant than Morrigan, so that's why her relevance score is lower. Overall score 4.3 out of 10. A below average character for me, fine enough due to her usefulness in combat, but not interesting or enjoyable enough for me to use in most of my playthroughs. Especially because it's not like Wynne's Spirit Healer specialization is unique, so I can just make Morrigan or my Mage Warden a Spirit Healer and have access to the group heal and revival spells. Finally, we come to Zevran. In terms of personality, I think Zevran is also one of those love or hate characters, simply due to the fact that he's very confident in himself and his identity, which can often rub people the wrong way. He's not traditionally masculine, he's bisexual, and he unapologetically enjoys the pleasures of life. Personally, I love Zevran's personality just like I love Morrigan's, but I can understand that sometimes he can feel a bit overconfident, oversexual. In general, his personality can feel overpowering. He has great banter with the other companions, and I feel none of the companions harbor particularly strong animosity towards him, even if they find his humor and flirting coping mechanisms aggravating. Dragon Age Origins is truly dark fantasy in the original sense of the word from literature genres, a world full of oppression, prejudice, injustice, and suffering. In the context of this, Zevran can perhaps feel a bit too fun and cheery, tone-deaf. Leliana and Oghren are also similarly out of place at times, though Leliana could be excused as she's genuinely trying to be optimistic and see the good in the world, whereas Oghren is just there to be the butt of the joke. With Zevran, a lot of the confidence, humor, and sexuality is a persona he puts on because this is what helped him survive his difficult upbringing, especially when he was purchased by the Crows and had to endure the excruciating training their recruits are put through. In most contexts, I think it works well both as a contrast to the dark things you encounter and experience throughout the main story, but sometimes it just feels like too much. People have been calling these kinds of jokes and lines Marvel quips, particularly when referring to Dragon Age the Veilguard. But the truth is that Dragon Age has always had these quips, and some work better than others. Alistair's "swooping is bad" is generally regarded as good, whereas Zevran saying "nice vase, I should get one for my house" when you approach the legendary Urn of Sacred Ashes feels just completely out of place and ruins the wondrous feeling the whole sequence of approaching the urn was trying to accomplish. And this line comes completely out of left field too, because before that, as you enter the room with the urn, Zevran exclaims in awe, "Mother of mercy, it is real." Marvel quips work in Marvel movies because that's the tone that those movies have. They don't really work in Dragon Age because the regular tone is more serious, darker, or even if it is humorous, it's not that kind of empty joke thrown out to fill the silence or to distract from the fact that the story wouldn't be able to stand up on its own, or that the writers felt insecure and thought the story wouldn't stand up on its own. In any case, I feel like Zevran has the strongest case of Marvel quipitis in Origins, followed closely by Alistair. Oghren's just straight up fart jokes from B-grade comedy movies, his lines don't even count as Marvel quips. Due to this issue, I will be deducting quite a few points from Zevran's personality score, because while I enjoy his lines and interactions most of the time, the whiplash from these quips is too much and ruins the general effect of his character. Personality score 7.5 out of 10. Quite a bit above average, but I can't give him anything above this due to the tonally inappropriate jokes. When it comes to character development, Zevran suffers a bit due to the circumstances of how he joins the Warden's party. You may think that Zevran has a very nice and clear arc of character development because he's the assassin sent to kill the Warden, fails, and then joins the Warden's party to fight against the very man who hired him. The thing is, all of that is just external plot. Other than wanting to live, Zevran doesn't really have any reason to fight alongside the Warden and against Loghain. He's from Antiva, he doesn't care much about what happens in Ferelden, and certainly the Blight could easily be defeated without the help of one Antivan assassin, who is better utilized for actual assassinations instead of fighting Darkspawn on the battlefield. If you befriend him, he can open up about the real reason he accepted the contract on the Warden's life. He was tricked into believing a fellow assassin he was in love with betrayed his team, and so Zevran and his other friend and teammate Taliesin killed her in cold blood. Then they found out that it had been a lie, and Zevran wasn't able to forgive himself for what he did. So essentially, him accepting the contract was more so a suicide mission. He was hoping the Warden would defeat and kill him. If the Warden doesn't kill him, he is given a chance to move on from blaming himself and finding purpose once again. But while this is all implied, I don't really feel that Zevran himself truly internalizes this change. He grasps at the chance to live because, well, dying is scary, and there's always a part of you that wants to survive, to keep going, even if you're deep in depression, grief, and self-loathing. Zevran at the end of Origins feels the same as Zevran when you first meet him. He's ready to go and wander around on adventures, essentially running away from responsibility, running away from feeling his feelings by distracting himself with danger and pleasure. Character development score 4 out of 10. I don't count the external plot of his arc as character development because survival instinct isn't an arc. However, Zevran opening himself up and at least discussing his trauma is at least a little glimmer of hope towards an arc. If you just take that glimmer and imagine what it could be, you can see a far more compelling version of Zevran take form. Alas, that's only in our imagination, so the score remains below average for what is actually in the game. As for relevance, this is where things get a bit interesting. I'll get combat out of the way first so we can talk about story. As a dual-wielding rogue, Zevran is a good damage dealer. He has the assassin specialization, which obviously helps with quickly getting rid of enemies with backstabs, critical strikes, and of course the massive damage bonus the whole party gets on a target affected by Mark of Death. Rogues in general are also great for utility purposes such as opening locks and disarming traps, which gets you extra XP, loot, and in the case of traps, an easier combat experience. I think that his build when you get him is pretty decent, and you get to recruit Zevran early enough after completing one main quest that there's not too much attribute autoscaling either. He is slightly less useful than Leliana from a lockpicking and disarming point of view, because in the vanilla game he doesn't have any points in that tree, despite telling you he's proficient at opening locks. But the issue with lockpicking can easily be resolved the next time he levels up. From a story perspective, Zevran is surprisingly relevant. He comes from Antiva, which of course has a different culture and society than Ferelden, but it's not too different, such as in Sten's case with the Qunari society he comes from. Zevran will often remark upon various things and compare them to his expectations based on his previous experiences in Antiva. This works well to both characterize Zevran and get you to learn a little bit about Antiva. But it also makes you think a little bit differently about how things in Ferelden are because you're hearing an outsider's perspective on them. Sten and Morrigan are also outsiders, but Morrigan was raised in the wilds and doesn't have enough knowledge of and experience with any society to draw interesting comparisons. If she had been part of a Chasend or Avar tribe, that would have been a different situation entirely, and she could have had much more to say that would compare and contrast regular Ferelden society with her tribe's way of life. Similarly, Sten is simply too much of an outsider, having an alien and alienating philosophy that doesn't really fit with the story the game tells, especially in Ferelden. Zevran, however, comes from a way of life that is just slightly different here and there, while having enough similarities to ground him within the setting in a way that fits. His mother used to be Dalish, and even though she died giving birth to him, he held on to her Dalish gloves for a long time, and often wondered what the Dalish were like. So when you do the Dalish main quest, if you take him along, he has a few things to say. Sure, he doesn't really know anything about the Dalish elves, but his curiosity and slight wistfulness towards what could have been, what he came from, adds a little bit of nuance that you don't get from any other companion during that quest. He similarly has things to say about the political situation in Orzammar. Even though he didn't have enough direct experience with the dwarfy dwarves before, in Antiva there are plenty of disputes among nobility and especially among royalty. Backstabbing, assassinations, espionage, blackmail, all of these things are common in Antiva among the powerful, and Zevran is well acquainted with them due to his profession as an assassin. He also has relevance in the whole arc against Loghain, as he was literally hired by Loghain and Howe to kill the Warden, so it's satisfying to have a reminder of Loghain's failure there as you beat him once and for all at the Landsmeet. Of course, you can also bring him along during your interactions with Master Ignacio during the Trial of Crows questline, and he'll obviously have opinions there due to being a former Crow himself. He doesn't have as much to say in Redcliffe or during Broken Circle, and has that terrible line about the nice vase during the Urn of Sacred Ashes. But as far as companions who aren't crucial to the main plot go, he's fairly relevant to a few main quests and adds something meaningful to the way you see and think about the world, characters, and story presented to you. Due to all of this, Zevran's relevance score is 8 out of 10. Great in combat and exploration as a rogue, and surprisingly relevant in terms of story and lore. His overall score comes down to a 6.5 out of 10. In this list, he actually ends up being below Alistair due to Alistair having the huge advantage of being super relevant throughout the entire game. And the thing is, even though I like Zevran's personality better, I do end up having Alistair in my party way more often, so the score checks out. Okay, that was a long one. Time for the final ranking and conclusions. On the top of the list is Morrigan with an 8.8 out of 10. As I've said, Morrigan is my favorite character in the entire series, and so I am aware I am very biased towards her. But I hope I've also explained in a slightly more objective fashion the ways in which she is interesting and relevant despite her polarizing personality. Leliana and Shale are tied in second place with a well-deserved 7.8 out of 10. Great characters with interesting personalities, backstories, development, and relevance, even though a little bit undercooked and or over the top. Their writing is solid and consistent, and it's no wonder that Leliana got such a big role in Inquisition. She has such a strong backstory, strong convictions, with motivations aplenty for continuing to involve herself in important matters in the world as she seeks to change it. It's a shame we didn't see more of Shale in the later games in the series, but considering her voice actress passed away, perhaps it's better that way. I wouldn't be able to hear someone else speaking Shale's lines. Alistair is in third with a 6.6 out of 10, just barely beating Zevran by a 0.1 point difference due to his huge 10 out of 10 relevance score. Lots of people love him in a cute little puppy or derpy best friend kind of way. I'm not much into either of those two character types, so I instead use him for his relevance as a warrior, as well as the fact that he's a Grey Warden, and if you're role-playing, it's quite hard to ignore the fact that Grey Wardens are supposed to be superior at fighting Darkspawn. Zevran is in fourth place with a 6.5 out of 10, and I think that's probably one of the fairest, most non-biased scores I've given to a character on this list. I enjoy Zevran's character, but I can also extremely clearly see his shortcomings. This puts him at a slightly above average score because, while the overall effect leans towards positive, there is still plenty that could have been done better. The dog is in fifth place with a 5.5 because despite being just a dog and not really having all that much to add, he's cute, loyal, a good team player, and quite useful in the early game. He never truly feels like a full companion because he doesn't change, isn't able to communicate much, and your bond with the dog is very static. I think he could have been a far more compelling and enjoyable animal companion if there had been some development in the bond between your warden and the dog. I wish the dog got treated more seriously by the writers and designers instead of just being the cute animal companion. Loghain comes in 6th place with a 5.3 out of 10, mainly due to his very intriguing character and potential as a companion. Unfortunately, he is genuinely less relevant than the dog as a companion because you recruit him so late, when almost everything has already been completed. Despite this, I still scored him higher than my 3 least favorite characters in the game because I am extremely biased against them. Wynne comes in 7th place with a 4.3 out of 10. She's very relevant as a mage, but if you have either Morrigan or a mage warden in the party with the heal and group heal spells as well as a few other utility or buff spells, you don't really need her. She's not all that special. Her personality is really off-putting for me, and I hate the fact that she has 0 character development. This is in fact applicable to the last 2 characters in the ranking as well. Sten is in 8th place with a 3.6 out of 10, and Oghren is in last place with a 2 out of 10. While you can use them in your party as warriors, there are better options such as your warden if they are a warrior, Alistair, Shale, the dog early on, and even Loghain, who comes well built as a weapon and shield tank. They don't have any character development and their personalities are aggravating, to me at least. This has been my ranking of all the companions in Dragon Age Origins, scoring them based on personality, character development, and combat and story relevance. These are, of course, the elements that I consider important in a companion, as well as my own preferences for character types and personalities. Your opinions may differ, and that's perfectly fine. I am trying to foster a kind, respectful, and thoughtful community here. Everyone can have their own opinions and preferences, and there is no right or wrong answer when talking about your own personal experience with a piece of fiction. Keep that in mind when discussing your own thoughts in the comments down below. That said, I am very curious to know your own rankings of the companions. If you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other RPGs, do remember to subscribe and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.